Are Saudi leaders playing a game to protect whoever ordered the killing of Jamal Khashoggi? Turkey's president thinks so and says the kingdom's investigation must reveal all. As the US considers its options and the European Union faces further calls to ban arms sales, will the Saudis budge? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. Turkey's president is accusing Saudi Arabia of stalling the investigation into the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. Recep Tayyip Erdogan says the aim is to protect someone. He's ramping up the pressure and wants to know where the journalist's body is. Saudi Arabia's chief prosecutor met his Turkish counterpart for a second time in Istanbul after what Turkish sources called an unsatisfactory first meeting on Monday. Sources say the Saudis have finally handed over the testimonies of 18 suspects who are being held in the kingdom. Where the suspects should be tried is being argued over. Turkey's calling for their extradition, and the Saudis insist they'll be tried at home. Before we get to our guests, let's hear what President Erdogan had to say.
We can't leave this case unsolved. Revealing who killed Khashoggi is a humanitarian and ethical duty. It is also a judicial and political duty. There's no point in putting illogical obstacles. There's no point in stalling in order to save someone.
The White House says it's continuing to consider its options.
The president met last week with CIA Director Gina Haspel after having gathered additional intelligence on her overseas trip, and the administration is weighing different options and will make an announcement about what the decision of that action is.
Austria's foreign minister is backing calls for the European Union to stop Saudi arms sales. Karin Knessel told the German newspaper Die Welt the halt in arms deliveries proposed by Chancellor Merkel would be a correct signal. The horrible war in Yemen and the Qatar crisis should be reason enough for European Union members to adopt a common stance towards Saudi Arabia. If we all, the entire European Union, would stop arms deliveries to Saudi Arabia, this can contribute to ending those conflicts. Let's introduce our panel in Birmingham. Scott Lucas, a professor of international politics at the University of Birmingham and a specialist in US relations with the Middle East. In Istanbul, via Skype, Andrew Finkel, a foreign correspondent in Istanbul and co-founder of P24, an initiative to promote independent journalism. A welcome to you all. We'd like to begin with you, Andrew Finkel, in Istanbul. President Erdogan there referring to the protection of someone. Who's he referring to? Who's he alluding to there?
Well, he's clearly Turkey has several aims in this exercise. They're trying to see that justice should be done, and of course at the same time they are playing a geostrategic game. So they're dealing with big regional politics, and at the same time they really want to see that justice for Mr. Khashoggi is done and seen to be done. And often these two objectives don't really coincide.
We are seeing a change of tone in President Erdogan's rhetoric. He seems to be ramping up the rhetoric. He began this crisis very diplomatic, and then as the leaks came out, he took ownership of those leaks, and he was very angry towards the Saudis and their cooperation. Is this a measured approach, or a sense that he's just simply frustrated and wants to get to the bottom of all of this?
Well, I think, as I say, he's playing a very serious game here. He's, taking a very large economy, the Saudi tiger, by the tail and trying to shake it. He seems to be, at the very first, we thought that he was intent on really causing not so much regime change, but trying to, if not actually bring down the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, at least to diminish his authority dramatically. Now, it could be that he's engaged in a very serious game of bluff, that there's high stakes here that we may not even know about, negotiations behind the scenes, that Turkey is trying to extract benefits and privileges from this turn of events, or it could be, as you say, he simply is fed up and wants the Saudis to bring the culprits to justice.
Let's bring Scott Lucas here in Birmingham. You heard what President Erdogan had to say, that he feels that someone is being protected. Is that someone the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, do you think?
You got it in one. It's interesting, though, that Erdogan won't name the Crown Prince, and he has refused to do so in speeches over the past couple of weeks. The one person he will name is King Salman. He'll talk about the king very respectfully as the guardian of the two holy places in Saudi Arabia, His Majesty. And at that level, I think Erdogan's game is, you know, King, we like you, but you need to do something about your boy. Now, whether that doing something about the Crown Prince is to remove the Crown Prince or merely to contain him, to limit his ambitions, that's one question. The second is what Turkey wants beyond the Crown Prince. Is it really just a case of getting justice for Khashoggi's murder, or is Turkey trying to get leverage against Saudi on regional issues? For example, the Saudi-led blockade of Qatar, Saudi involvement in other areas such as Iraq and Syria, or even, some would say, the most ambitious goal of being seen as the leader of the Sunni Muslim world.
But all of those things have been discussed over the last few weeks, but the Turkish president hasn't made any demands, certainly publicly, as of yet, has he?
Well, because you don't put all your cards on the table at the start. I mean, Andrew's absolutely right that this is a very high-stakes game, and you keep cards in your hand. And again, you do this at two levels. One is that the Turks, and this is at the root of their disagreement with the Saudi prosecutor who has just visited, is they are holding back some of the evidence that they have. They're not revealing the exact extent of what they've got. That's to keep the Saudis guessing. And secondly, when it comes to your aims, you don't immediately play your cards and say, we want A, B, and C. You watch to see how the other side moves. And I think right now we're still at that first stage. We're still at that stage, I think, where Ankara is deciding how vulnerable Mohammed bin Salman is. They're looking at other parts of the world. And interestingly enough, not just the U.S., not just Europe, but remember, most Arab countries have backed the Saudis. It's not just UAE, it's countries like Jordan and Egypt. So if Erdogan makes a move in the region, he's got to make sure that those countries won't come fully to the defense of the Saudis if he's deciding on a confrontation.
Andrew, you've been reporting on this story for a while now. The Saudi prosecutor met his Turkish counterpart. The first meeting, certainly the Turks say at least, was disappointing. The second meeting allowed them to get access to the statements from the 18 suspects. What's the next move? What's the next kind of investigative diplomatic move between the Saudi state prosecutor and his Turkish counterpart, do you think?
Well, on the surface, it would look like the next move is stalemate, that Turkey is very keen on having these 18 suspects repatriated to Turkey, where they would stand trial. And I think the chances of that happening are very slim. So, clearly, they're as part of this, if it's a poker game or a legal process that we have yet to decide. But, the next move is to really make this very serious demand that justice be seen to be done, and it be seen to be done at the scene of the crime, which is Istanbul, where this murder took place.
Scott Lucas in Birmingham. Turkey doesn't have a great record on human rights. It's been criticised by both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch for arrests without charge, for cracking down on journalists, for cracking down on bloggers. And certainly in some parts of the US, we've heard that there is fear that they will not get a fair trial in either Saudi Arabia or Turkey. So there's the idea that perhaps the trial should take place internationally. Where do you land on this? What do you think? Do you think there is a potential for an international trial, or is this about Turkey and Saudi Arabia and the trial taking place in one of those countries?
Well, first, you're right to mention that no one comes into this with clean hands. And given that Turkey is the largest detainer of journalists per capita, and given the purge of many thousands of people from the Turkish system, teachers, students, lawyers, the military, since the failed coup of July 2016, this case isn't being pursued by President Erdogan in the name of human rights. That said, the real gap is we have no international legal authority that I think can step in here. Remember that this murder took place on Saudi soil technically because it was within the consulate in Istanbul. And we have no, the International Criminal Court, Interpol, whose head is detained in China, coincidentally right now. there's no one that can step in. So I think the most likely outcome, if I was to bet on it right now, would be that Turkey will not get the 18 suspects. They will try them instead in absentia in a Turkish court. That way they can reveal their evidence. And if they decide to name the Crown Prince almost as an unindicted co-conspirator, they have that option.
That seems a very dramatic move. It will certainly ratchet up tensions between Turkey and Saudi Arabia if they are tried in absentia. Where does that idea come from? It's certainly the first time I've heard that.
Well, I think the idea is simply that you have the option of how far you want to go politically. And it is politics, not the law, that runs here, which is you can make the argument that because the 18 moved outside of the consulate for elements of this murder, for example, of course, they had to get from the consulate to the airport to get out of the country. Because they moved vehicles around that are supposedly tied to the murder, you can make the case that they have broken Turkish law. As I said, trying them in absentia, it is an option. It is not one which has been often used for defendants from another country, but it is just very much of how much Erdogan himself wants to go in terms of embarrassment at one level, and two, I think in making demands of the Saudis, which is, all right, perhaps we won't take this all the way in terms of trying them in absentia if, for example, you give me A, B, and C. The question is, as we've just discussed, what are A, B, and C going to be?
Andrew Finkel in Istanbul, a trial in absentia, do you think that could even fly within certain Turkish circles, or is this just another option on the table?
Well, I suppose it's a partial option. The way the Turkish judicial system works, it's like a French investigative magisterial investigation. They could begin a case, they could present their evidence. It's a legal examination as opposed to a trial that begins on a Monday and ends on a Friday. So they could certainly initiate criminal proceedings. Of course, a consulate is different from an embassy, as far as I know, that it's not all of the consulate premises have that extraterritorial status that an embassy would have. So it would be possible to say that perhaps we don't know in which room in the consulate the murder is meant to have taken place, but it may be possible to claim that indeed it did take place on Turkish soil.
Scott Lucas in Birmingham, you're an expert in US relations with the Middle East. We heard the White House spokesperson there say that the White House is considering its options. What are its options?
Well, that depends on what part of the administration you talk to. There are some agencies within the U.S. government, notably the CIA and the State Department, who are very agitated by the fact that this murder took place. At the very least, it's an embarrassment, given the U.S.'s close links with Saudi Arabia. Many congressmen, legislators are agitated. Some are demanding action. But the bottom line still here is that Donald Trump, in perhaps a rare moment of honesty, said from the very start that his priority is that $110 billion of arms sales that was announced last year during his visit to Riyadh. And in addition to that priority on the arms sales, the point man who has been in contact with Mohammed bin Salman is Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and he is saying we don't break any links with the Saudis. So I think unless the congressional pressure really ratchets up, and that's not going to happen in the next few weeks before an election, or unless there's an unexpected development in this case, I think at the end of the day, the U.S. maintains its arms sales, the Crown Prince stays, and both Washington and Riyadh hopes that the controversy will go away in a few weeks or a few months' time.
Scott Lucas, there is another element to all of this. There seems to be a disconnect between some elements of Congress on both sides of the aisle and what the Trump administration, the Trump White House want. There's a lot more tougher language coming from some parts of Congress against the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman than perhaps is coming from the US administration and the White House.
Yes, and remember, there's a backdrop to this which goes all the way back to 9/11. Because 15 of the 19 attackers were Saudi, there have been congressmen who have long agitated for action against the Saudis. The whole furor over the classified portion of the 9/11 report, which is about Saudi Arabia. In recent years, there have been some congressmen, a relative few, who have been agitated by the Saudi-led intervention in the Yemen civil war. And so there have been recurrent calls to hold up arms sales to Saudi. And indeed, a small amount of arms has been put on hold, even before the Khashoggi murder. But you balance that sentiment in Congress with another factor, and that is that the Trump administration has put its cards all in for regime change in Iran. And you cannot pursue regime change in Iran, which turns especially upon economic measures, unless the Saudis support you, because you need Saudi oil to cover the shortfall of Iranian oil being basically curbed by sanctions. So Saudi still has a leverage. As long as the Trump administration wants to go against Iran, wants regime change, the Saudis can come back to Washington and say, look, are you going to choose the Iranians or are you going to choose us?
Well, let's bring in Washington, D.C. right now. We have Joel Rubin joining us, president of the Washington Strategy Group, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. We're discussing the options that the White House has when it comes to Saudi Arabia. What are the options that you think that they have when it comes to the Crown Prince, when it comes to Saudi Arabia over the Khashoggi murder?
Well, thank you for having me. And there are a variety of options that the White House has at its disposal. They could first and foremost prevent him from traveling to the United States. They could implement sanctions from the Magnitsky Act. The White House could do a withholding of military transfers, withdraw support for Saudi's air war into Yemen. So there's a variety of measures. But really the question is the political will for doing it. And right now it doesn't seem like the White House has much will in that space. They certainly clearly now want to have an investigation go forward, but they don't want, it appears, to have the investigation go to the level where it touches Mohammed bin Salman. And so Congress is going to get additionally frustrated and look for measures and ways to put pressure on the White House to take some real actual concrete action.
Why is Joel Rubin, why is the White House seemingly so wedded to the Crown Prince?
They really have invested their Middle East policy in the bilateral relationship with Saudi Arabia, be it, as the previous speaker was saying, related to Iran and the desire to have oil that would cover the losses from Iran when Iran sanctions kick in about a week, or to isolate Iran more through Gulf partnerships, as well as they're looking to Saudi Arabia to put pressure on the Palestinians related to Middle East peace. And so there's a significant investment. We also don't know what is happening behind the scenes with Jared Kushner and other senior officials in the White House. And certainly if the Democrats take a chamber of Congress, they're going to look into that. But right now, the White House is leveraged deeply into the relationship with Saudi Arabia and is very loath to weaken that.
Joel Rubin, just one more question to you before we move on to the rest of our guests. Iran is very much on the cards, on the table. It has been for a very long time. But in the last 4 weeks, we've heard about pressure being put on Saudi Arabia, pressure being put on the Crown Prince himself. Is the Trump administration's Iranian strategy in tatters right now?
I wouldn't say it's in tatters, but it's under duress. There is certainly a lot of questioning here in Washington. To keep the Washington perspective on this, there's a lot of questioning about the wisdom in following a Saudi lead on Iran, or from the perspective of the U.S. foreign policy, to make it all about Iran when we see that Saudi Arabia has behaved like they did in Turkey with the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. So there's a lot of questioning, but in tatters, no, not yet. The Treasury Department is continuing to execute sanctions. The State Department continuing to engage diplomatically in the pressure track. And there really is no alternative diplomatic track yet that they've created. But that's not different from the past year of engagement with Iran. But certainly there are a lot more questions now about the wisdom of this strategy, and it doesn't appear that this can hold in this manner for an unending amount of time. There will be a point at which the Trump administration is going to have to come up with an alternative way of dealing with Iran than it currently is doing.
Let's bring in Andrew Finkley in Istanbul right now. President Erdogan, his advisors, his team must be taking a look at everything that the US is doing when it comes to both Saudi Arabia and Iran. What would be the Turkish strategy right now? What's the next Turkish move when it comes to regional politics and particularly Iran?
Well, Turkey has several aims. I mean, on one level, as your speakers have already said, that Turkey is vying with Saudi for a moral leadership in the region, and it sees this current crisis as an opportunity to be one up on the Saudis, certainly. But of course, the Turkish economy is not like the Iranian or the Saudi economy. They don't have oil, and they need to buy oil, and they're very nervous about the effect of Iranian sanctions on the price of oil. The Turkish economy at the moment is sort of running on fumes, and they really do need not to be isolated or insulated from the rest of the world. So what they would be looking for from America, certainly, is a waiver on being able to purchase Iranian oil. That may not be coming. But they certainly don't want to be in a position where the United States, for example, imposes a major fine on one of the state-owned Turkish banks, Halkbank, which was seen to be in violation of Iranian sanctions, which busted Iranian sanctions some time ago. So they're looking for some sort of economic easy ride from the United States. They don't want to be put under pressure. And I suppose that's possibly one of the reasons why they're upping the rhetoric in order to make their bargaining position stronger, so that they, at the end of the day, will not embarrass the United States policy.
Let's talk about the United States policy. Scott Lucas, let's bring you in here. Does the relationship between the Trump administration and Mohammed bin Salman, rather than Saudi Arabia, need to be reset in the wake of this? And why isn't the Trump administration really looking at that? It seems to me that it's almost protect the Crown Prince at all costs.
Well, because this administration at one level, when we talk about Donald Trump and his inner circle, they don't function as, quote, a normal bureaucracy. They function very much on personal ties amongst a small elite, which Joel Rubin was talking about. And the fact is, even before Donald Trump took office, there were back-channel meetings between his inner circle, not just Jared Kushner, but someone named Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, the mercenary group, with officials from Saudi and, importantly, from the UAE, who have played probably an underestimated role in all of this. And those personal ties are what the Trump administration was using rather than, say, working through the State Department and through the military, up to the point where they initially backed the Saudis when they blockaded Qatar back in 2017. Now, the question is whether the agencies, the State Department in particular, are going to say, look, we need to use this episode to row this back a bit. I don't think by going after Trump regarding saying you've got to get rid of the Crown Prince. But for example, what I expect Washington to be possibly urging is a reconciliation amongst Gulf countries. In other words, let's urge the Saudis to make peace with Qatar, to end the blockade, and let's turn, therefore, the negative of the Khashoggi affair into a positive, which is the U.S. gets a stable relationship with not only the Saudis, but with Qatar, where they have a major base, and the rest of the Gulf countries as they try to put pressure on Iran.
Joel Rubin, let me bring you in here. We've heard there that it is time to perhaps reset the relationship, maybe bring in the Gulf countries a bit more and not to rely solely on Saudi Arabia. Is there any way you can see that happening?
I absolutely can. I believe that the Trump administration is going to face continual calls for why it's pursuing a Saudi-centric foreign policy in the Middle East, in particular when we have longstanding allies such as Qatar, such as Kuwait, such as Oman in the region, the Emirates. These countries all have had strong relationships with the United States, and it's to our strategic advantage to engage all of them and not rely on one and be led in our foreign policy. But that is going to take real work, and the president did try to lean in to resolve the Gulf crisis last year. It seems to have some dissipation, but it's not resolved in any clear way, and so that has to be a priority for this administration if it wants to get its foreign policy straight going forward.
We are out of time. Thanks to all our guests, Scott Lucas, Andrew Finkel and Joel Rubin. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.